I am completely obsessed with Elden Ring and love this game with every fiber of my being. Just had to get that out of the way right off the top. This game is everything and more that I hoped it would be. As much as I want to make Elden Ring content, it's so hard to just put the game down for 2 seconds to actually make a video. I was honestly feeling overwhelmed about making a boss rankings video due to the sheer size of the game and amount of entries when my good friend REM Gaming, check his channel out in the description, simply said, just rank them by area. And I said, yeah, that definitely makes a lot more sense. So I will eventually make a comprehensive video once every boss in the game is discovered and played, but we're going to go by area first. Today, of course, will be Limgrave, so if you're worried about spoilers, don't worry, this video will only cover up to Godrick the Grafted, who caps off Stormveil Castle. I'm not going to use my typical boss ranking categories of aesthetic, arena, soundtrack, gameplay, and lore, as many have soundtracks that are extremely similar or actually the same. A lot of the arenas aren't particularly unique from one another, and the lore either hasn't been fleshed out yet, or little information generally exists in reference to their stories. We might dive deeper into the cream of the crop once I finish the entirety of the game, but for now, each boss will simply be a brief general discussion. The links to all my prior Souls Rankings videos are in the description as well, please check those out. Again, as we are all at different points in the game, I would ask that you please try and keep the comment section to Limgrave only, as to not spoil later parts of the adventure for others. I hope you guys are all having a blast. I might try to get a stream going today or tomorrow, maybe starting a new character in Limgrave or messing around with some PvP in early areas. Anyways, I hope you enjoy the first entry in the Elden Ring ranking series. Soldier of Godrick. Some of you may have forgotten this guy was a boss by now, and I wouldn't blame you at all. He's essentially a common enemy with a boss health bar, perhaps intended to give new players a confidence boost, recognition of when a boss fight is occurring, and a chance to play with the mechanics in a low-stress fight. Not too much to say here, as the Soldier of Godrick serves his intended purpose. Miranda the Blighted Bloom. There's nothing wrong with a stationary boss if it has a proper attacking array to keep the player on their toes. However, Miranda really has no defense mechanism to prevent you from simply wailing away, as the poison accumulation isn't rapid enough to offset your offense, plus her minions are easily dealt with. She has a Divine Pillars-esque attack that can get you if you're not careful. Aesthetically, an interesting design, but an additional Vine Whip melee attack would have made the fight more interesting. Scaly Misbegotten. Aptly named, as this is another boss you may have literally forgotten about, as he's a common enemy with a health bar. He presents an opportunity to work on roll dodging, as even if he hits you, you'll likely be able to outlast his health pool. Not much to say here, but I'm glad this didn't happen during a high point of play. Moving on. Deathbird Limgrave. Surely in the running for strangest FromSoftware boss, this abomination of a creature appears at night in a pretty random location, and the fight generally intertwines with the roaming giants. I assume the idea was to show the player a boss can appear anywhere, even amongst other enemies, but the gameplay ends up chaotic and sloppy, and not necessarily in a way that is satisfying. It is kind of funny to watch the giants arbitrarily attack Deathbird, so maybe that was the reason for the placement and combat. Either way, a very strange design. Deathbird Weeping Peninsula. We might as well just continue on with Deathbird number 2, location in the Weeping Peninsula. Essentially the exact same fight, except without other enemies in the vicinity. Due to the shape of Deathbird, the hitboxes, even if accurate, make the combat a little funky. Again, they're not the worst bosses in the world, but I really don't understand their inclusion other than for a good laugh. Stone Digger Troll. The problem with the worst to best boss rankings video is even the best games have some doozies, so the first part of the video may seem negative, but in reality I am obsessed with Elden Ring and absolutely love this game. That being said, I didn't love the Stone Digger Troll. Maybe I just have to adjust my gameplay, but I find the shockwave ground attacks to linger further outside what the animation would suggest. He even has one big attack that leaves an earthquake that essentially comprises the entire arena floor. Maybe I should just get good and apply the new jump mechanic properly, who knows. Mad Pumpkin Head. As much as I love Elden Ring so far, it wouldn't be honest to me to say there's a feeling that Limgrave would have benefited from including fewer bosses and really zoning in on the quality. There are a solid 8 to 10 bosses that are really just common enemies who have a health bar at the bottom of the screen. They are bosses just for the sake of being a boss with no unique identity or movement. Although a massive pumpkin-shaped helm is something you don't see every day, so I'll give him that. I know I'm being a party pooper, but I think the Elden Ring fairy dust has clouded our vision a bit as to how mundane and generic some of the Limgrave bosses are. Not to worry though, as always with FromSoftware, the top 10 or so are spectacular. Black Knife Assassin. One drawback of having so many bosses in one area is that you're going to be OP by the time you get to some of them. Unfortunately for Black Knife Assassin, he was the recipient of one such mauling. I appreciate seeing the growth in the power of your character, however, and that is one of the tenets of an RPG. One of my favorite aspects of FromSoftware games has always been that the characters do not scale. They are what they are. I'm not a fan of games where the characters simply scale to whatever level you're on. This completely undercuts the feeling that your character is growing and improving. Anyways, due to the brevity of this fight, it's hard to say too much, but he does look badass aesthetically. Erd Tree Burial Watchdog and Imps. I can think of approximately 0 bosses where adding little gnat-like enemies nipping at you enhances the encounter. Simply adding more stuff to a boss room increases the feeling of artificial difficulty that frustrates the player, rather than giving the boss itself a unique move with a specific timing the player has to work out and feels motivated to overcome. That being said, this boss is hilarious, and once one-on-one isn't the worst boss in the world. Demi-Human Chiefs. This tandem actually took me a few tries to get down, as I believe he was the first boss in the world I interacted with given the location of the cave to the first step. A boss that has a fairly simple moveset, so to counter this, random common enemies scatter the area, which you guys know I love in a boss arena. I'm not positive on the reason for having a 2-for-1 boss where it's possible to fight them one at a time once you realize the second one won't come out if you stay close to the fog. Perhaps to teach the player to zone enemies into specific areas. I'm not too sure, but either way, an okay boss that's not terrible, but likely forgettable. Rune Bear. This dude is literally just a giant bear. I do appreciate that his attacks are generally readable, as bosses of this type often fall into the trap of just flailing all over the place, creating frustration for the player, as it becomes difficult to determine where the attack hitbox actually is. This big boy thrashes and pounds his way around the arena and does offer a nice riposte opportunity once his posture is broken, a mechanic that has been a fantastic inclusion. Again, not a ton else to analyze here. He's a massive angry bear that wants to eat your face. Cemetery Shade. Obviously an enhanced version of the Mad Ones from Hemwick Charnel Lane in Bloodborne. I have not finished the game myself, so please no spoilers below for myself or others, but I don't know why if you're gonna pull an enemy from Bloodborne, it'd be this one, although I will admit his character design and smoke trail movements do come off pretty slick. As a nice callback, he even has an attack that can entrap you, similar to the one the Witch of Hemwick uses. Melee-wise, his quick slashing dual cleavers inflict bleed quite rapidly. Not the most difficult, but a nice little inclusion for Bloodborne fans. Patches! Of course, patches are a version akin to him was gonna be in the game somewhere, so it was up to FromSoftware to put a new twist on the bastard, and they did just that, introducing him in a completely unexpected way. As you wander into the room thinking, okay, probably attack the chest a couple of times expecting a mimic, only for Patches to slink out from above. This encounter really isn't about the combat, but more an NPC introduction, as at half health in typical Patches fashion, he surrenders and henceforth acts as a merchant. A nice surprise for Souls vets, and I, for one, was happy to see the old scoundrel. Tibia Mariner. I don't know how intentional this is, but this is another boss that I personally found hilarious. The whole scene of this spectral skeleton, once a sailor, rowing around the graveyard in his sunken ship cracked me up. The combat is what it is, honestly, but this fight just exudes Miyazaki's quirkiness in design choice at times. I don't know who personally designed this boss, but if nothing else, it's unique, and unique is often memorable. The most difficult part of the fight is probably just avoiding the skeleton friends he spawns, but other than that, just have fun with this one. Guardian Golem. This grand, gigantic foe is always satisfying to take down in a classic David vs. Goliath showdown, although on this occasion I gave him a pretty abrupt and thorough spanking, so it's difficult to account for his entire moveset. Versions of the Guardian Golems are scattered throughout the areas I've adventured this far, so while not particularly unique or sporting the most plentiful moveset, these gargantuans are always satisfying to conquer, and bonus, the excitement that arises for the critical riposte once these monsters start tipping is always fucking exhilarating. Erdtree Burial Watchdog. In my first run-in with this abomination, I was co-oping with my friend Dunbeetle, and I genuinely started laughing out loud, even as he had warned me how ridiculous this boss was. Check his channel out, linked below. Upon seeing this creature, even my wife said, number one, that's clearly a cat, number two, now I'm gonna have nightmares. In all honesty though, he's really not that bad of a boss, and like I always say, I'd rather take a boss that's unique and memorable over one with a flashy moveset we've seen a million times, any day. As silly as it seems, I genuinely believe quirky bosses like this help contribute to the colorful culture, memes and all of FromSoftware games. Knight's Cavalry, Limgrave. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, on my first few attempts, I thought this was one of the worst bosses FromSoftware has ever made. Upon the rage of a few deaths subsiding and rational thought prevailing, the fight actually grew on me a bit. Number one, his blacked out aesthetic wielding a massive axe on horseback looks sensational. It could be that I'm just not very good at it yet, but I'm finding the steed-based combat to be pretty hit or miss. As well, the placement of these common enemies nearby who kept intervening in the contest became not a deal breaker, but at least an unnecessary annoyance. As well, you have the time constraint of the giant slaves and carriage coming your way. It would have made more sense to have this version of the fight be in Weeping Peninsula, whereas that version without enemies nearby and in a wide open space gives much more opportunity to gain an understanding of the new mechanics. Beastman of Farum Azula. It's possible I'm overrating him a touch, but this guy actually has a pretty varied arsenal of offensive attacks. He even has one spinning jumping combination reminiscent of the Abyss Watchers from Dark Souls 3. Add in a thrust and a slam, and you actually have to be pretty vigilant and on point about when to time your dodges or make use of a shield. As with many of the early bosses in Limgrave, the enjoyment of this fight is going to rely heavily on when you come across him. An early encounter is likely to be a nice challenge, however, if you don't find him until later, you'll most likely maul him and miss a good portion of his arsenal. Grave Warden Duelist. I know I generally bias towards humanoid bosses rather than large beasts, but I genuinely found this boss to be a bit of fun. His dual hammers attached to chains are a pretty unique setup and allow for close quarter and ranged attacks. He can even just straight up grab you right off the ground. His old school Navy Mariner helm looks fantastic too. I'm not positive that's what it's supposed to be, but I definitely get sailing vibes from him for whatever reason. Definitely not the most extensive fight in the world, but fun for what it is. Grafted Scion, the rematch. I didn't know if this was going to be a Vanguard situation like in Demon Souls, but it's actually possible to return to the very start of the game and rematch Grafted Scion. There's a portal you can find in the second region of the game that transports you back so you can get revenge on this guy, as I would assume 99% of players probably died to him on their first attempt. His spider-like movements and usage of multiple rapiers, plus a shield, is quite clever and can be a bit difficult to maneuver around, but the unique challenge offers a nice little fight. You can also find a version of him grafting away in his shop in Stormveil Castle. Erdtree Avatar. Not that the bosses up to this point are terrible or don't have any redeeming qualities, but many of them aren't particularly unique or essentially are buffed up common enemy encounters. This is roughly the point in the list where the quality really starts to increase, however, as there are a number of fantastic bosses in Limgrave. This magical tree spirit guardian has quite a diverse moveset, as his attack keeps you on your toes at range and in close, along with a golden faith attack, which he often follows up with an overhead slam utilizing the massive hammer that he wields. The design makes sense for what it's supposed to be, and is pretty satisfying dodging his giant aforementioned weapon. A nicely balanced encounter and a solid entry. Ulcerated Tree Spirit. This boss scores more highly as a spectacle rather than for the actual combat involved. Navigating your way down below the first step past the chariot, you'll find this majestic hidden away beast. It's interesting, sometimes in making these videos you get a much different perspective, usually a more honest one when you rewatch the footage. After originally fighting this creature, I thought he was just flailing around everywhere and had unfair hitboxes that made it unclear when to roll dodge. In rewatching, I thought, wow, that's a pretty damn cool boss, and for the most part, I just really wasn't dodging at the right time, and there are ample windows to move and attack. Add in his dazzling buff and shock, this is actually a solid encounter who, upon review, moved a few slots up the rankings. Knight's Cavalry, Weeping Peninsula. You could technically encounter this version of the fight first, as he only appears at night, and you do the mini-bosses in any order, but as I mentioned in the other entry, it would have made more sense for this fight to be closer to where you begin your adventure. It was actually after this fight, in a nice open field without common enemies interfering, that I rethought my other encounter, as I enjoyed this version quite a bit after conquering my foe, realized, wow, that was a pretty damn cool boss. Yes, he wields a different weapon, but it's interesting to realize you can take essentially the exact same boss and in one setting have a positive experience and in another setting come away thinking the fight was terrible. Anyways, I came away from this one thinking the combat aboard Torrent was more fun than I had been giving it credit for. Bloodhound Knight Darawale. If any of you are MMA fans and remember the famous Nick Diaz quote to Carlos Condit, "Oh, we're throwing spinning shit now?" That's what this fight is for me, as I can't read or time bosses with whirling, twirling movesets to save my life. That being said, the Evergals are one of my favorite additions in Elden Ring and generally contain fantastic bosses from what I've come across so far, with 3 of them being located in Limgrave. His quick in and out movesets can make him a frustrating target to get a hold of, along with his, as mentioned, spinning moveset, utilizing the Bloodhound's Fang, which he drops upon defeat, makes him quite the substantial foe. Definitely one of the better bosses in Limgrave as we enter the cream of the crop. Side note as well, this is the figure in which Blade asks you to locate, and he will show up upon victory with a small gift. Leonine Misbegotten. He doesn't necessarily have the most unique or varied moveset in the world, which is a bit disappointing, but he is presented in a manner that makes the occasion feel important. Characters based on lions always seem so majestic and important because of their status as king of the jungle. Side note that just occurred to me, do lions actually live in jungles? It doesn't seem like they do. Anyways, this badass one lives on the beach in a fortress apparently. While it's not the weapon he uses, the grafted blade greatsword that he drops mentions it being a lone surviving champion from a country now vanished was so determined to continue fighting that he claimed the swords of an entire clan of warriors. If I'm being honest, I did expect a bit more of a phase 2 being the important location of this fight, and he actually has a pretty typical moveset. A fight that will definitely be dependent on how many mini-bosses you have completed upon meeting him, but a unique environment and aesthetically cool foe nonetheless. Ancient Hero of Zamor. Another enemy with a multitude of spinning attacks and an excellent addition at that, as with the 2 other Evergaol encounters. Using swift, flowing water-like movements, this graceful opponent glides around the arena with ease. In addition, this ancient hero is one of the coolest looking bosses in Limgrave, including donning a spooky, emotionless mask. Add in some interesting frostbite attacks, including kicking up a blizzard, as well as laying some ice on the ground, which are mixed in nicely with the hero's melee offense and a more aggressive phase 2, and this is one of the best bosses in Limgrave. Should you defeat this masterful combatant, you are rewarded with a very useful talisman in Radagon's Scar Seal, which is essentially the prisoner's chain from Dark Souls 3. Flying Dragon Agheel. Similar to the tree Sentinel, this titan of an enemy circles fairly close to the first step. This one is hard to judge, as the boss is more about the spectacle than the combat itself. If you run into the flying dragon early and try to fight him like Midir on foot, you'll most likely be swiftly torched to death. However, should you return leveled up and with a better grasp in the art of Torrent's combat, your trusty steed should allow you to fairly easily dodge any offense, and you'll realize the dragon actually has a pretty limited moveset that's avoidable once you read the patterns. That being said, the idea of an open-world dragon boss is still a sight to behold, along with fighting him atop your trusty companion is a pretty satisfactory event. Again, not the most difficult once you level up, but his entrance and spectacle of it all warrant a nice spot in the rankings. Bell-bearing Hunter. Certainly in the running as one of the most difficult bosses in Limgrave, this warrior only appears at night in the War Master's shack. I'm not sure if it's insinuated the War Master transforms into the Bell-bearing Hunter at night or not, as when this boss appears in the exact spot as Bernal is not present. Maybe some sort of full moon thing? Who knows? Either way, not only does this boss have an interesting origin, he looks awesome with his black armor contrasting against the red dye of his magical blade. He reminds me of a souped up version of a Dark Wraith, perhaps because of his slow stalking movement followed up with devastating attacks. You'll notice a pattern that most of the best bosses have defenses against standing at range as well as getting in tight. This keeps the player always on their feet, keeping the action going whether you're attacking or not. The range of moveset, the setting, and the aesthetic certainly make Bell-Bearing Hunter one of the best bosses in Limgrave. Tree Sentinel. I can't understate how fantastic this boss is, and the design choice to flip traditional area scaling on its head and place this high-leveled, golden-clad, magnificent warrior at the start was brilliant. For obvious reasons, he really reminds me of Gyobu Oniwa from Sekiro. The readily available encounter is so enticing to draw on the classic, okay, one more try, and is a constant test in growth of skill and character improvement. Alright, one quick try. Damn it, still not good enough. One more. Shit, still not ready. Let's keep exploring. The Tree Sentinel is by far the best use of a boss in the open field environment in Limgrave. As mentioned, he looks absolutely stunning, his glorious armor with his horse clad in similar attire. The golden halberd he wields mentions in the description that the Golden Vow skill is passed down from antiquity among the knights of the capital. If this is any sign to come, I can't wait to get there. Combat-wise, I found him easier to deal with on foot rather than on torrent, but this could be because I'm still getting used to the steed back fighting style. Either way, he sports a nice array of moves with offset timings, which is certainly a theme so far, as many bosses have mastered the art of roll catching, apparently, having trained under Pontiff Sullivan, maybe? As previously mentioned in other entries, the splash zone of his shield attacks is tough to get a read on, unless that's just my misuse of the jump mechanic and bad timing. That aside, just an outstanding boss. Crucible Knight. This guy is an absolute beast of a warrior, and as well as being one of the best bosses in Limgrave, is also one of the most difficult for a couple of reasons. First of all, his massive sword deals huge damage as well as has ridiculous range, easily punishing healing. Get close in on him, and good luck getting around his massive shield ornate with a horn. You got all that down? Nope, now I have unicorn wings and a magical dragon tail, bitch. Truly some of the best combat found in Limgrave, he covers all aspects of fighting, dealing close and ranged offense with a touch of magic. The incantation he drops mentions emanating from the Erd Tree's primal vital energies. This corresponding incantation can actually be found upon defeating another version of him in Stormvale Castle. He's quite hidden and takes some getting to, so you'll probably have to watch a how-to video to find the path. Certainly one of the harshest foes in Limgrave. Margit the Fell Omen. Maybe a bit of a boring choice, but I'm gonna slide in Margit at number 2, as I truly thought this was an excellent boss, and along with Godrick, one of two that truly felt like big time encounters. I could be mistaken, but I believe Margit and Godrick are the only two mandatory bosses for Limgrave. If you have the skill, I suppose you could just run right to Stormvale to start the game. Again, difficulty on only one run is pretty hard to judge, as you'll come across bosses at vastly different levels depending on your route of exploration. I probably ended up here a little sooner than expected, as I was so excited to go to Stormvale, but this made me realize what a great boss Margit is due to my multitude of failed attempts with much trial and error. Phase 1 is pretty straightforward once you gather the dodge timing on his massive staff, but Phase 2 is where this fight shines once he kicks up the aggression and adds in a massive incantational hammer and sword. I wouldn't say his and Godrick's designs are aesthetically beautiful, but they certainly are unique and unforgettable and make sense with the story. Perhaps I revere this boss so much because it's the first in the game that gave me the classic Souls feeling of coming across what initially seemed like a completely daunting foe, but persevering, learning Margit's patterns, and defeating this beast felt pretty damn exhilarating. Godrick the Grafted. As with Margit, perhaps a generic pick for the top slot, but if anything, certainly the most important boss story-wise up to this point. As with all of my rankings, I'm always open to moving bosses around the list, as this is not a mathematical exercise. In addition, sometimes your views on bosses change on second and third encounters once your skill improves or you come with a different weapon or new build entirely. While some have mentioned Godrick being too easy, I do find him to be a fantastic boss and honestly one of the few that tells a full story. Obviously every boss can't have a cutscene, but the foreshadowing of Godrick's adoration with the deceased dragon followed by the mid-fight cutscene in which he chops off his own arm to replace a dragon head in order to stop you is one of the most badass things I've seen so far and makes Godrick a straight-up gangster in my book. As mentioned numerous times, your experience is probably going to vary with how much you explored before coming to Stormvale, as in this encounter I had completed every boss for the sake of this video's footage, which made me completely OP. This was on my second character, however, as my first completely blind character took quite a few more tries as I was about 10 levels lower. Godrick sports a nice variety of melee attacks with his massive axes, whips up some crazy tornadoes which are quite fun to dodge, along with some earthquake attacks in Phase 1, but Phase 2 is where this fight really shines with the addition of the dragon's fire and sheer spectacle of the encounter. Again, maybe a generic pick, and I'm open to hear what everyone else thinks, but for me, Godrick slots in as the best boss in Limgrave. Thank you so much to everyone for stopping by. As always, I hope everyone is loving their journeys in Elden Ring. In the next couple of weeks, time depending, I'll put out a rankings video for the second area. In the meantime, please check out any of my previous Souls rankings videos by clicking one of these links. I hope you enjoy the content, and I will see you soon.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.